Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots to get to this morning. Of course, we're going to bring you up to speed on what is going on with infrastructure and reconciliation and this battle between the progressives and the corporatists. All of that we're going to get to. Also, an amazing and incredibly revealing moment on CNN. Faz Shakir, who was Bernie's campaign manager, calls out Heidi Heitkamp. The CNN anchor rushes in to defend Heitkamp's honor.
Right.
You just got to watch it. Dr. Fauci saying some interesting things about our holiday and what to expect. Massive trove of documents, largest leak ever, called the Pandora Papers, exposing the way that the super wealthy hide all of their funds. This implicates world leaders. Also very interesting what it says about our own super rich here in the US. They don't even have to try to go overseas to hide their wealth because the tax rates are so low here. They can just they've already rigged the system so much that they don't even have to hide what they're doing. So good for them. Great job, guys. Big bombshell news in the Stephen Donziger case. He is being sent to federal prison for 6 months for daring to try to hold Chevron to account. We will get to that. I also sat down with Andrew Yang. His book is being released tomorrow and talked to him about his plans, pressed him on the third-party thing and what he wants, what his tactics are. I actually felt like I came out of the interview with a lot better understanding of his mindset and what he was actually up to, and it made a lot more sense to me after I talked to him. But we do want to start with where we are in reconciliation and infrastructure and all of that. So last week, of course, there was a big showdown. Gottheimer and the corporatists, they wanted a vote on the infrastructure package. They wanted that to pass.
Yes.
Pelosi had originally said, okay, we'll give you what you want. You'll get a vote next week. This came down to the wire. Ultimately, they pulled that vote because progressives, for once, actually held strong and used the leverage that they had and said, listen, we are not going to vote for this thing until we have a vote on the reconciliation package. And ultimately, that is what happened. The vote was pulled. The infrastructure bill did not get voted on. And now we're kind of back to square one in terms of negotiations over that reconciliation package. The other thing that was interesting, and we can throw this first element up here on the screen, is that Biden seemed to side more with the progressives in that he backed the idea of keeping these two things linked, which was the proximate battle that they were fighting last week. He exited the Capitol here on Friday after visiting and said, we're going to get it done. But on the other hand, he's also signaling, hey, this $3.5 trillion mark is going to have to come down. And he said, this was his quote, I wrote the damn bill. Even a smaller bill can make historic investments in childcare, daycare, clean energy. You get a whole hell of a lot of things done. So progressives did win this one battle. It shows you that when you do work as a bloc, when you do threaten and actually play a little hardball and use your leverage, you can actually impact the direction that things are going in. But we're a long way from finished here, and ultimately it looks like there's going to be probably a giant haircut taken on this reconciliation package, if anything actually gets through at all.
That is the biggest question here. And so our friend Jeff Stein kind of been at the forefront of the reporting on this. Let's put this up there on the screen. So one source is currently guesstimating here about what Joe Manchin wants to cut from the bill at $1.5 trillion. I'll put a strange addendum on this. I'm not sure if everybody saw, but Friday the Manchin team leaked a document that they had signed with both him and Chuck Schumer. Now, this was a laying out of demands. Basically, Joe Manchin was trying to prove, he's like, no, I've been playing, ball with the Senate Majority Leader this entire time. It's just that my demands are such that a lot of other people in the Democratic caucus wouldn't necessarily align with them. So he wants to show, no, he actually has real policy demands. He could get to yes, as opposed to one Kyrsten Sinema, who doesn't seem to have any demands at all. Now, his $1.5 trillion there, as Jeff rightly points to, it was include paid leave, child care, child tax credit, some of the climate provisions, but Manchin has already said he's not necessarily there on those. But this, Krystal, is where I do think that, again, I see the potential for this entire thing to fall apart. And the reason why is that even amongst those provisions that he's talking about, paid leave, childcare, child tax credit, and more, Manchin wants means testing on every single one of those programs. He doesn't actually want to fully fund all of them, both on philosophical reasons, but also on spending, not opposed to all the stuff that's already been left out. And we've already had several senators themselves, people like Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, so not, by any means like a Bernie Sanders, be like, no, that's not acceptable to me whatsoever. So even within the so-called 1.5 trillion top line number put forth by Joe Manchin, there are irreconcilable differences within the Democratic caucus itself. And on top of that, Kyrsten Sinema has not said whatsoever that she's even cool with this 1.5 trillion. I do think it would be harder for her to like stonewall necessarily against this. So I still see a lot of roadblocks, even if they do try to come to this sort of consensus decision.
I mean, my question with Kyrsten Sinema is bottom line, like, does she care about anything other than selling herself to corporate donors for her post-Senate career? And certainly, then I'll have more on that in my monologue, but certainly her actions don't seem to indicate that she cares about anything other than that. How much do those corporate actors care about getting the bipartisan infrastructure deal passed? I don't really know, right? I don't know how important that is to them ultimately. So that's the other question mark in my mind. But Jeff has, of course, a great piece. I mean, he's such a good reporter, really stands out from the pack in terms of just actually doing his job and doing it extraordinarily well. He talks about there are effectively, if you're starting to talk about, all right, so it's not going to be $3.5 trillion, we got to cut it back. There are two directions you can go in. One is you can say, all right, we're going to drop a bunch of these programs and we're not going to means test. We're not going to put an expiration date on these things. And we're just really going to shrink down our focus to what are our top 3-4 priorities. We're going to fund those and that's it. And everything else gets left out. So, do you do the Medicare, dental, vision, and hearing aids? Do you do the child tax credit? Like major things. If you go in that direction, major things are going to get left out, which I think makes it harder to get everybody on board ultimately, because I can tell you the progressives are going to be very upset if certainly climate is left out, if any of the Medicare expansion is left out. There are a lot of key pieces here. So that's one direction is we're going to fully fund, but we're only going to pick like maybe 3 of these programs. The other direction is to bet on the idea that, hey, if we pass these things to start with, but they have an expiration date, that people are going to like these programs, and it's going to be hard then to roll them back when they come up and have to be renewed. There is precedent for that. I mean, you do see with the Affordable Care Act, for example, even though it wasn't that popular, and even though Republicans ran election after election on repealing it, ultimately when people had these protections in place, it was hard for Republicans to roll back. So that's another example where, okay, so we don't fully fund these things indefinitely. We just give them a 2, 4, 5-year time frame. That cuts down on the cost, but we can get a lot more of these programs in. The other thing that you would put into that bucket is things like means testing, which I am dramatically opposed to because I think it just undercuts both the efficacy and the political favorability of all of these programs. So option 1, you do only a few of these things, but you fully fund them. Option 2, you use some of these, I don't want to call them gimmicks, but use some of these methods to cut back on the cost, cut back on the length of time so that you can do a lot of the programs, but they're not ultimately fully funded and they're not permanently put in place. So those are the choices that you're talking about. Now, the next question is, what is progressives' hard line going to be on how much are they willing to cut back? Because Bernie has been saying all along, with justification, 3.5 was already the compromise position. Biden ran on $6 trillion. Bernie ran on more like $10 trillion. So 3.5 was already a gigantic haircut from what probably needed to be done. Pramila Jayapal is out saying, with regards to Manchin's $1.5 trillion, and I think we have a tear sheet up here, and she's been, she's the chair of the Progressive Caucus, so she's been a formidable player in all of this. She says about the $1.5 trillion price tag, that is not going to happen. So it's going to have to be north of $1.5 trillion. We also heard from Senator Sanders yesterday on the Sunday shows about what an acceptable price tag might look like. He is backing off of, he had been very firm, it's $3.5 trillion, that's it, that's the number. So he's backing off of that. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
About where the president is on this. As I understand it, he has now floated a $2 trillion top line number on this broader bill. You are at 3.5. I remember you initially wanted closer to $6 trillion. Are you comfortable with the idea of cutting this down to about $2 trillion?
No, well, first of all, I'm not sure that that's accurate. As you know, there's a lot of gossip that goes on. What the president has said is that there's going to have to be some give and take, and I think that that's right. I think, if anything, Jonathan, when we especially talk about the crisis of climate change and the need to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, the $6 trillion that I originally proposed was probably too little. $3.5 trillion should be a minimum, but I accept that there's going to have to be give and take. But at the end of the day, the real
okay, so give and take, but not $2 trillion. That's not enough. Because the president also said that a smaller investment could create historic achievements. But $2 trillion is not enough.
What the president is saying is that what we are trying to do is for the working families of this country, for the children, for the elderly, we're trying to pass the most consequential piece of legislation since the Great Depression. And he's right. The bottom line is we have got to pass it. We've got to pass the infrastructure bill. And the American people are going to have to stand up. You know what bothers me about this whole thing? Poll after poll shows what we are doing is exactly what the American people want. It's not what the big money interest wants, not what the lobbyist wants. It's what the American people want. And we got to do it.
So this sets up the next big fight. $1.5 trillion, Pramila Jayapal, and I think you can kind of read between the lines where with Bernie Sanders, too low. You're not going to be able to get enough packed into that to make it worthwhile. And I think progressives might actually hold strong and vote against that. You start getting up to $2 trillion and it starts to really depend on the details. What are they doing in terms of means testing? What gets left in? What gets left out? What does the time frame look like? All of that. So I think in terms of negotiations, and this is what Biden said, he kind of floated this $2 trillion number. I think that's the ballpark that you're ultimately going to be in. And now all of the ticking, clock of the infrastructure vote that was supposed to happen last week, all of that is gone. One other side note, it looks like with the debt ceiling, the parliamentarian ruled that they can lift the debt ceiling without having to attach it to the other budget piece that they've already passed through. They can do it on a separate track. That will probably be ultimately what they do, even though they don't want to do that, because then they have to put a specific number on it. But that's probably the direction that they're going to go in, even though they should just mint the coin, as I've said before.
There we go. First of all, obviously mint the coin. I do think increasingly this continues to trend in Obamacare direction. And while yes, something is going to get passed, even the way that they talk about it, 2, 1.5. I mean, Sanders is the only one of the politicians I've even seen speak to, here's what's actually in this thing.
Yes.
Talking about it consequentially. Manchin, it all just seems like funny money. And it's like most people, it's not even that the people are opposed to spending money. They just want to know what you're spending money on.
Right.
The signaling on this has been a disaster from the White House. They're just like, oh, 2 trillion, 1.5 trillion. Nobody knows what's in the goddamn bill.
That's such a great point. It's such a great point.
Yeah.
And it really, by talking about the dollar amount, you really play into the hands of the Manchins and Cinemas of the world.
Right.
Because we keep coming back to this. When was it an Exxon lobbyist who was talking about, listen, we're not going to go after the individual programs because they're popular. We're going to talk about, the pay-fors, the dollar amount, it's too much. So when you're just fixated on these numbers that sound really big, well, then you're playing into the hands of these, fake deficit hawks who are really just carrying the water of corporate America. Rather than when you talk about these programs, when you talk about, hey, maybe every kid should be able to go to pre-K.
Right.
Hey, maybe
and that's a debate.
We should have free community college. These things are really, really paid leave. I mean, all of these provisions are extremely popular. Negotiating Medicare prescription drug prices, 80% support. So they don't want to have that conversation. And you're right, Senator Sanders is the most effective at continuing to turn back to, okay, well, what are we actually talking about here? What is this actually going to do for people? What are the programs involved? Rather than getting fixated on, is it 3.5? Is it 2.5? Is it 2? The actual details and what they're going to do for people's lives, that's the real ballgame, and that's where the conversation should actually be. Biden, though, I don't think he really cares that much about these details. I think he cares about having a win. I think he cares about a legacy. I think Pelosi, it's the same deal. This is kind of her last final big act as speaker, most likely. And so she wants to have a W in the column. But they don't actually give a shit about like what it really
They don't
does for
care what's in
people.
it.
They
That's
just
the
wanna
problem.
win.
That was Obama. Obama just wanted a bill, and it ended up being a morass, and then it hung around, and it drove our politics for 10 years. And unfortunately, I see a very, very similar future.
Yeah, those failures on Obamacare. I mean, obviously, we still working class people still live with the consequences of what that should have been and what it ultimately ended up being.
That's right.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.